Aurora just dropped in Marvel Snap. Here are some top 100 tested decks that you should be able to play to great success with this very interesting new card. Aurora is a 6/6 with an on reveal that gives +2 power to a card at each location with one of the 4 abilities, of course, those being activate, on reveal, ongoing, and end of turn. This means that in theory, Aurora could give +8 to a location if you have one card with each ability at that location. Sometimes there are also cards that double up, like some of the Thanos stones, have both an ongoing and an on reveal, or Mr. Fantastic First Steps has both an activate and an on reveal. Those are going to show up a lot in these decks, but not necessarily as much as you'd think, because as much as I thought Aurora was fairly limited in terms of its applications, I originally expected it to be mostly a Thanos card and held back by the weaknesses of that archetype. But what actually has ended up happening is that it turns out that thanks to Sam Wilson and a couple of other generally double duty type of cards, you can actually get a decent amount of output out of this card in a lot of fairly safer mid-rangey styles of deck, which allows a certain type of archetype, the ongoing techie archetype, to arise out of Aurora's release. I think that's a really interesting thing to happen. It's just not really what I expected this card to be doing. I expected it to be a Thanos spot, but it's become much more of an imagine if Doctor Doom was good kind of card, where it's just a lot of power output in confusing ways on the final turn of the game. A very fairly costed 6-cost card. It does feel sort of like when you're looking for that 6-cost card for your mid-range deck, you're looking at Magneto, you're looking at the rest of this stuff. Now you're also looking at Aurora. That is kind of the vibe I am getting off of her. You're looking at Magneto, you're looking at Red Hulk, and you're looking at Aurora if you are able to build your deck in a way that allows you to do it. She's also pretty aimed at mid-range piles in the sense that mid-range piles sort of by definition are these sort of synergyless mishmashes of cards that do things efficiently. And Aurora is a card that brings that synergyless mishmash together and says, actually, you were a synergy deck the whole time. One of the things you'll notice when playing an Aurora deck is your point output is fairly middling without Aurora a lot of the time, unless you are using her as a sort of secondary plan. But a lot of these decks that are built to be Aurora decks, I felt a little bit full of air when they didn't have Aurora. But when they did have Aurora, they felt quite strong. And you'll see some of this reflected in some of the deck building choices being made here. People are going to be trying to find the right balance of synergyless cards. But largely, if I were to describe this card in one word, it is God's greatest gift to mid-range players. And I realize that wasn't one word. Shout out to Charles Barkley. This is the Aurora list that I've been doing the most playing of, but before we get into that, please remember to like and subscribe to this channel. If you enjoy my content, I really appreciate it, and every little bit helps. You can also leave a comment. I still read all of them. Now, as for this deck, it is a slightly modified version of a deck Honifer was playing, which is a slightly modified version of a deck Safety Blade was playing, which is a long way of saying that a lot of these decks kind of start looking the same once you start mid-range piling it up. You get your Spider-Ham, you get your Hydra Bob, you get your Sam Wilson, you get your H.E.R.B.I.E, you get your Kate Bishop. That's kind of in everything. And really what's setting this list apart is the inclusion of Shadow King, Luke Cage, and Anti-Venom as a method of getting some additional energy cheat here. I was playing around with Superior Spider-Man here. He was very medium, but I don't necessarily have any better ideas. Honifer was on Luna Snow. Zombies Go Nom Nom was on Prowler. The biggest question for these decks existing is it worth being an Aurora deck versus being a Merlin Werewolf deck? And I think that is going to be the biggest question for her entire existence, because a lot of this stuff looks like things that Merlin Werewolf would be pretty good in, except Merlin Werewolf doesn't work very well with Aurora because it is using your energy on things like making your werewolf bigger instead of making cards and putting them on the board, which is really all Aurora cares about in order to maximize her. I haven't found a good fusion of those two things, so you are in a situation where you have to choose, and I do think it's a very real possibility that Merlin Werewolf ends up being the dominant mode of this kind of mid-range deck after people get used to playing with Aurora. But I don't necessarily think that she's bad. I think that she's good enough that she makes it a real conversation. And that is really relevant because I think Merlin Werewolf has pretty consistently been among the best, maybe top 3 mid-range strategies over the last few months. It's just been around, it's been doing things. V-Hand has slightly overshadowed it at times, but it has consistently been a powerful points output engine, and Aurora is kind of competing with it, and that is notable. The other thing Aurora tends to take off the table for you are things like Cosmo and Juggernaut. I mean, like, yeah, you could play them all, but it makes them very hard to use correctly and really asks a lot of you as a player when you start doing stuff like that. I think the Safety Blade version of this list had Cosmo and Juggernaut in it, and it's like, I get it, but that is just a lot to ask. And I think that basically this is kind of the shape that Aurora decks will tend to take. Basically like the first 5 cards and the last card are kind of locked in, and then the other 6 are what you're really playing around with. A beefier version of the mid-range pile comes from Derek. Now, I am 1 card off from him here. I'm running Sam Wilson over Lizard in largely deference to my Aurora, but I understand the argument either way. I think that what this deck is trying to do is get bigger as best it possibly can than other decks in this space. And what I like about what this deck is doing is that it's using its tech in a sort of proactive way. It's just really Red Guardian and Mercury Cannonball to deal with troublesome things, but that covers a shocking amount of ground when you have access to that kind of stuff. Silver Surfer First Steps allows you to double up on Aurora if you're able to pull it off, but also doubles up on Iron Patriot, which is a great way to juice the power level of a deck that, when it doesn't have Aurora, can feel a little bit anemic. This is one of the big things that I noticed when playing a lot of that first list was if I don't get Aurora, I'm kind of just sort of staring at my opponent and being like, oh, well, I hope my very low point output can beat you. This deck definitely has more ways to get points on the front end with Iron Patriot, Silver Surfer First Steps, and on the back end with, of course, Aurora and Silver Surfer First Steps. Now, this deck does have a lot more beef in it. It loses out on some of the tech. That is a very real thing, but I do think there is enough here to point out that there are multiple schools of thought when it comes to making Aurora mid-range decks. I talked about the 5 cards that are locked in. You're missing a lot of them here because the question is, are those 5 cards high enough power when you aren't getting Aurora stuff? And that is sort of the opposite approach here. We want to make a deck that is already functional and then by nature adds Aurora as a top-end hammer. That's what this deck is really trying to do. And I think it's a really well-executed direction for the deck to go. Another thing this deck gets to do that I think is really, really cool is be bigger than the other decks that are doing Aurora stuff, which is a natural advantage in a baseline early metagame. I think that it's pretty clear to me that one of these styles of decks will sort of eventually win out and become the Aurora midrange deck. And I'm not sure the Aurora midrange deck will always be the right choice for you to play, but I do think it's a breath of, I won't say necessarily fresh air, but if you were someone who really loved playing like Wiccan style mid-range piles, like if you missed the days where it was just you and some fair cards, I think this kind of stuff comes pretty close to making you feel that way. And I think that somewhere in between the 2 lists we just talked about is sort of the Aurora deck. And I think it'll be pretty interesting trying to find it. A couple of different points stacky decks here. This is Aurora in the Maverick shell. It should be noted, and has been by many people, that Silver Surfer is typically like the worst card in a lot of these Maverick decks. So the idea here is basically, let's use Aurora as like, what if Silver Surfer were just a better card? I don't know how well that stacks up, but I do like that it allows us to actually play a deck that has a curve in it for once, as opposed opposed to Silver Surfer, whose curve looks like a tree stump. Now, this is a deck that is fully about utilizing the buffs that Aurora gives you and mixing them with the buffs that Maverick gives you in order to create very, very large Lashers and very, very large Captain Carters and very, very large Human Torch first steps, and generally a lot of other things that get completely obliterated by Shadow King. This, I think, is not likely to be the best Maverick deck. I wouldn't be surprised if some other more, like, fused Maverick deck, like a Jocasta combo style deck, ends up being a little bit more dominant. That said, it is noticeable how good Aurora is at enabling this kind of stuff. Like, again, I don't think any of the decks we've talked about, except maybe those two mid-range ones, are the kind of things you're going to see on my tier list forever. I think the mid-range ones have a real chance. I think this is likely to be one of those decks where it's like, this is the second best Maverick deck, right? That's never really a good way to get on the tier list. But I do think that it is relevant that this card is this good. Like, you are going to be able to really point vomit with this. And if you're a certain type of finicky player that likes seeing their cards add up into more than the sums of their parts, this card is amazing for you. Husky Puppies, in a very similar space, has identified the same thing I did when it comes to what Aurora's biggest problem is. Whenever you build this hard around Aurora, you kind of end up really doing nothing when you don't get her. Using Blink in order to make sure that you get her lets you play one of these low to the ground piles a lot more easily, because you can basically guarantee that any 3 turns into Aurora whenever you want that to happen. That means that you are not going to be in situations where you have all this point output, but you don't have the finisher in order to make it happen. I mean, you could, right? There's 3 cards left in the deck at the end of the game. 2 of them could be Blink and Aurora, but it makes it much less likely. This reminds me a lot of when I was running Blink in Loki decks in order to do exactly this thing, where it's like, all right, I've built my entire deck around this one card. Blink is a second copy of that card if I build my deck correctly. I think this is a really solid direction for this archetype to go. And if you're going to play like this sort of low to the ground, point spammy, Captain Carter-y like kind of thing, this is a good way to make sure you actually get your max point output. Because this deck, without Aurora, is a bunch of cards that just suck. They're not bad cards, but they won't win you the game. But with Aurora, especially Aurora with a Silver Surfer first steps, they will win you the game. Another very solid mid-rangey list in which Aurora, I feel, is in direct competition with Merlin and Werewolf. Like, when you look at this list, especially keeping in mind who it's from, this is an Ika list. Ika was the person who was doing Merlin, Werewolf, Darkhawk, right? Like, this is a direct competitor to Merlin Werewolf in this exact list, and that is harsh competition. And I keep coming back to that when we talk about Aurora decks, is like, if there is a problem with her decks, it is largely that it is up against one of the best point packages in the history of Marvel Snap. That is the biggest hurdle that Aurora has to climb, is that a lot of the things that she wants you to do are also things that Merlin Werewolf wants you to do. Oh, you want to make a deck full of like cheap cards that do things really efficiently? Oh, sick. We both want that, but you can't run us together. And the biggest question for Aurora is whether or not she'll be able to meaningfully displace that package in any of these lists long term. I think in the mid-range lists that we talked about at the beginning of the video, there's a reason they were at the beginning of the video. It is very likely to me that that is that is the most possible place where I think it'll happen. When it comes to this stuff, I am a little more suspect. I think this is really reasonable. It's a good 6. There's nothing wrong with a good 6. But is a good 6 better than Merlin Werewolf? That's the problem. She is in direct competition with them. And that'll come up a lot when you're making these deck building decisions. And I know it seems like a harsh way to evaluate stuff, but that's how you have to evaluate her. It's not her fault that this package is as good as it is right now and that it doesn't work with her very well. It is reality. And I think that she can come out on top of it in some cases. And that's a testament to how good she is. Because I don't think many cards that come out that are put in this position would be doing as well as she is. I realize that's a bit of a weird way to go about saying this, but I think it's indicative of her power that people are even considering dropping Merlin Werewolf packages from decks like this in order to get her in there. It's really notable. All right, so I mean, let's talk about Thanos. This is Smiz's Thanos list, and I don't really think Aurora's good in Thanos. I don't want to like just be like, oh, no, but like Thanos isn't very good. That's really what this comes down to. Is like Aurora quite good in Thanos. I think if you're a Thanos main, you probably want this card. Just a really good card there. I was not impressed by anything Thanos was doing in any capacity compared to this other stuff. And it's weird because I expected this card to be locked to Thanos. I didn't anticipate the sort of mid-range, pile-y, anti-venom type stuff that ended up being quite good with her for me. And I think that that's a reasonable expectation, but it's worth talking about like why that is. Thanos gets to double up on a couple of things that Aurora really cares about. First of all, thanks to the stones, a lot of cards on the board. Cards on the board, that's the number one criteria you need for Aurora to actually make sense. It's why she doesn't work with Merlin Werewolf, because those aren't cards on the board and she doesn't buff them. Like it's a whole thing going on there. But those cards get rid of cards on the board. They actively don't want cards on the board. They want spells so you don't take up the board space. Thanos is the opposite. It is all about cards on the board. It's just that the numbers this deck outputs are not very good, and especially at high levels, it often puts you in situations where your final turn output is really, really telegraphed because you've used so many of the spaces on the board, and that's a good thing and a bad thing. And I think that that is the biggest thing Thanos runs into is like, it's doing a lot to make this card make sense that when you really get down to it, it kind of doesn't seem like Aurora actually needs you to do all that stuff to make her make sense. Like, if anything, Aurora Thanos is over-investing in Aurora and dragging her down with Thanos' mediocrity. From Derek, there's a guy in my comments named Beta Ray Bill Lover. Every time I talk about Beta Ray Bill, guaranteed comment from that guy. So this one's for you, my man. This is a Hammer Aurora deck. The basic premise is exactly what you think it is. This is a great card for the Hammer deck because it's effectively adding a bunch of power to your Hammer turn. You have this, play Thor, I play Beta Ray Bill, I play Jane Foster, I play two Hammers, I play Aurora. A lot of point output here. Like, it's a much more mid-rangey take on the archetype than the Odin Misery all-in Hammers stuff, which naturally means that I like it more, but you know, that's beside the point. You also get like some really solid ability to just like play a relatively fair game of Marvel Snap. You have your, of course, thing first steps, mid-rangey type stuff. You've got your Silver Surfer to double up what you're going for with your Aurora, but she can also double up the Hammers or the putting the Hammers into your deck if that has to happen, or the Iron Patriot. Just a lot of options here, basically. And Aurora is basically just like bigger, better Doctor Doom here. That's kind of the theory. A lot of what this deck is doing is just like kind of solid stuff. And there's really nothing to complain about when it comes to the output here. It does what it does, and it does that stuff pretty well. Aurora works both when you are doing your full Hammer game plan and when you're just playing some cards. You just gotta put some cards on the board, and that's what really her strength is. Like, I think that looking at her as like a card you have to make a 624, probably not the right way to go about it. You can just make her like a 618 and feel pretty great about it. Last up, another one from Ika, Zooora. I think at this point though, like, what is the meaningful difference here with these decks? It's like, it's the same Aurora cards, right? We got a Spider-Ham, we got a Sam Wilson, we got a Hydra Bob, we got a Zombie Mr. Fantastic, we got a Kate Bishop. Like, these are the same cards. it's the same stuff. It's those 5 cards, and then we have Aurora at the top end, and maybe a Think First Steps, and then you get to pick 5 other cards. It's Team Clash. That's what Aurora deck building is. Aurora deck building is Team Clash. There are 6 cards that you run in every Aurora deck, and then you pick the other 6. And like it's an oversimplification, but it's not far off because there's just so few options low on the curve for like anything that makes sense with this card whatsoever. Oh, cool. You're gonna take Zombie Mr. Fantastic out and put H.E.R.B.I.E in? Wow, you're really cooking there, dude. Like, there's just a lot going on here. This is using a sort of Shauna and Spider-Man Noir and Iron Man package. Like, the idea here is basically, I'm going to give myself another nut draw into this list thanks to Spider-Man Noir, which actually, like, great card with Aurora. You definitely want to see it. It helps get cards out of your deck when you can actually trigger it. Those cards come in with a lot of power. That allows you to fill up the board more. You really are excited about that. Again, we talk about board filling in the context of Aurora. All of the cards that come off of Shauna, well, most of them are going to have one of the abilities, so getting those extra procs also pretty important. This deck allows you to do what I would describe as like, how do I say this? It's kind of day one-y, where I think this is cool, but I don't expect to see this one on the tier list. I expect to see it doing day one stuff right now. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I have been KMBest. You have been phenomenal. And I will see you in the next one. But first, a final reminder that there is going to be a tournament broadcast live on my Twitch channel. We are going to do a full tournament with unique rules, no Aurora. Got to use a card from the last 3 months, and a couple of interesting things that we're doing with tournament scoring. If you want to join that tournament, there is a Discord link in the description. A fully free tournament. Prizes are, I want to say it's like, some cash to first and second and some PAX codes and some season pass codes. That's where my head is at. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I have been KMBest, and you have been phenomenal.